if you kind of sit down and like are really honest with yourself and are like, I'm always like looking for a guy in finance, 6'5", blue, like if that's my pattern, then like maybe there's something there.
Welcome to Sleeping Around, where we offer a peek behind the curtain of modern sex and relationship therapy and research, bringing you insights and conversations otherwise reserved for the therapy room. I'm your host, Alayna Joy, a Master's of Counseling Psychology student, content creator, and lifelong sex and relationship nerd. Enjoy the episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Sleeping Around. As you know, this show is about the psychology of sex, dating, and relationships, but not everybody is in a relationship. Not everybody wants to be in a relationship. Some folks do want a relationship but aren't in one currently. Some folks are single by choice. And I wanted to explore this idea a bit further, the idea of singledom. And so for today's episode, our guest is Dr. Yuthika Girme. She is an associate professor at the Department of Psychology at Simon Fraser University and the director of the S.E.C.U.R.E laboratory, which researches singlehood experiences and the complexities underlying relationships. Dr. Girme has developed distinct research programs investigating singlehood and relationship process that have important practical implications, including social support, attachment insecurities, emotion regulation, and social stigma. And in today's episode, we explore what it means to be single. What impacts does singledom have on a person's overall health and wellness? How can somebody be single and happy in today's world? Is it true that single people are less happy than coupled people? What about folks who are single by choice? We explore attachment styles and being single. And really interesting, we talk about whether or not it's possible to work on your attachment style while not in a relationship. And then over on the Patreon extended cut, we talk about how you can find a relationship if you've never had one. Among other things, the episode is full of interesting information, but also Dr. Girme was just a blast to talk to. So I hope that you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Can you start by telling me a little bit about how you got into this work and what your research focuses on?
Yeah, so a lot of my background training is actually focusing on romantic relationships, and a lot of my PhD work was trying to understand when supportive romantic relationships can be good for people, but also when they can be not so great and might actually have costs and risks associated with it. And a lot of this came about because one of the things that really drew me to relationship science was that relationships can be the absolute best thing for people, but also the absolute worst. And so a lot of my initial training was trying to really reconcile the costs and benefits of romantic relationships. And through that work is sort of where I sort of discovered singlehood, because I think one of the things that singlehood does is that it offers us the other side of the coin of when it comes to romantic relationships. And I think that in the same way that romantic relationships might have costs and benefits, so too can singlehood in ways that really mirror romantic relationships. And that really kind of got me interested in trying to understand singlehood processes, when single people can be really happy and thriving, and when they might find singlehood challenging.
How do you define singlehood? Because I'm gathering that it's a wider definition than just the spinster with her cats who, couldn't find a partner and she's miserable for her entire life. How do you define singledom?
Yeah, so singledom, really broadly defined, is anyone who may not be currently in a romantic relationship. Now, that's a really broad definition. And so I think even within that, there's important, distinct types of singlehood that are important to take into account. So for example, we may have people who are just currently single. So that might be that they're in between relationships, for example. But there are also, you can define singlehood as someone who's never married. Singlehood may also include people who choose to be single. It may also include people who are involuntarily single. So they want to be in relationships, but things aren't working out for them in that domain. It might include people who were at one point in time in a long-term committed relationship, but are currently single because of separation or divorce, or maybe their partner has passed away. There are definitely a wide spectrum of exactly what singlehood is for different people. But I think generally when we talk about this in the literature, we're referring to people who don't have a romantic relationship partner.
I asked my audience beforehand, I said, I'm speaking with an expert on singledom, singlehood. What are your questions? And many of the responses that I got fell within those categories that you just listed. Either I'm single and I'm looking to start dating. How do I get back into the field? Or I've just been broken up with. How do I face being single again? Or I've been happily single for so long, but the world keeps telling me I shouldn't be. If you could speak to each of those groups through what you've learned through your research, through the people that you work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think one of the great things about that is if there is one takeaway that people take from this podcast today is that singlehood is so diverse in the same way that people can be happily married versus in a toxic, bad relationship and wanting to be in a relationship with someone versus feeling like they're stuck and they'd rather get out of it. In the same way that there's diversity in our experiences in romantic relationships, we have diversity in singlehood experiences too. And trying to sort of break away from, these narrowly defined stereotypes, like you sort of mentioned, like, is it the spinster lady with lots of cats, who's really unhappy and desperate to be in a relationship? That is like, I think, one really narrow view, which might resonate with some people, by the way, and I think that's fine. But there is so much more to singlehood than just that.
Maybe let's start then with that kind of cultural trope of the spinster. Where does it come from? How do we overcome it?
I think there's probably a lot of different explanations for sort of where the sort of cultural meme or trope of a sad, lonely single person came from. I think one of the things is that, and we see this in sort of scientific literature as well, is often when we think about singlehood, what immediately comes to people's mind is romantic relationships and the contrast between the two. And I kind of alluded to this before, and even in terms of how I got interested in singlehood, is I really think that these are sort of two sides of the same coin in a lot of ways. You can't truly understand one without understanding the other. And so I think even in psychological literature, when people first started understanding or tried to do research on marriage is sort of where I think a lot of this started. A lot of the literature wanted to find a foothold for research about marriage and the well-being benefits associated with marriage. And for that science to be taken seriously, right? Because I think often in social sciences, if you're not sticking people into fMRI machines and drawing their blood and all these kinds of things, you're kind of seen as not doing real science. And so a lot of the early emerging research in this area tried to compare marriage to people who were never married or single. And often found that there was this well-being gap, that on average, that people who are married tended to be happier, healthier, live longer compared to people who are single. Now, we can sort of go into the weeds about those effects because there is some sort of nuance there and there are sort of pushback and criticisms about that as well. But generally what that ended up doing is setting up romantic relationships on this pedestal, as this is something that's really important for happiness, health, and well-being. And on the flip side of that, or at the expense of singlehood, that being single is sort of this undesirable status, that if you're single, that's going to set you up, for being at risk of being lonely, being dissatisfied in your life, not having meaning in your life, and ultimately something that you should try and avoid doing. So I think that's sort of where some of that negative stereotyping around singlehood really emerged, is that often when we think about singles, we're comparing it to marriage, and our society is very much set up in a way that prioritizes marriage, and we see some of those effects in psychological literature as well.
Maybe we should get into the weeds a little bit of the nuance there because, I hear that. And I also know that there are so many benefits to being single that research is finding. And we're seeing more and more online people talking about being single by choice and being single and happy. And I want to talk about that side as well.
Absolutely. So on average, I will say I do think that effect holds in the sense that there have been a lot of meta-analyses done to look at this relationship status well-being gap. And what a meta-analysis is it takes not just one scientific study that has looked at this, but it takes the effect across many different studies and finds the average effect across all of them. And often those meta-analyses do reveal that, yes, on average, married people tend to do better than single people. But there's sort of two important points to consider there. One, that those effects are fairly small in explaining well-being. So it's not like relationship status is explaining, 90% of that pie. It might be explaining sort of 5 to 10% of people's general well-being. And there's many other factors that go into explaining why people are happy. Relationship status might be one of those, but it's not like this huge overwhelming factor. But also that there's a lot of variability in that. So there is a lot of emerging research showing that actually that effect is true in some countries, but not in others. That effect varies across different societies depending on different social, structural aspects of a society or cultural norms that might be sort of relevant in different societies. Those effects can also be moved around depending on how you define single people. So if you look at census data, even people who are dating might be sort of lumped in as never married, right? But they're in relationships. And if you tease apart those groups and tease it apart based on, is this someone who's never been in a romantic relationship ever versus people who've dated but never married, people who've separated and divorced, widowed, people who choose to be single, you can sort of see differences emerge in that well-being gap. So I think there's still a lot of methodological nuance there, but on average, typically we do tend to see these effects. The second point I wanted to make about the well-being gap is often people have illustrated the well-being gap between singles and coupled people, but not really provided too much information about, well, why do those effects exist, right? Why are those differences there? And I think that's really important because if you don't explain why, then what ends up happening is that people have to just fill in the gaps based on their assumptions or stereotypes. And so I think what's happened, we see this at least in the scientific literature and how people kind of talk about single versus coupled people, is people assume that's because single people are really miserable. They might be like hermits, antisocial. There's something, quote unquote, wrong with them. And so that's just people kind of filling in gaps based on their sort of assumptions about what single people are like. But there are lots of explanations, right? For example, some of the research we've done in my own lab illustrate that one of the reasons that single people did report low well-being is because they actually perceive a lack of social support from their network and they experience more discrimination than coupled people. And that both of those factors, so how they're treated by others, is actually explaining the well-being gap difference.
Right.
Yeah, right? So it's
right.
And that mechanism, like explaining the why, becomes important then, because it's not that single people may necessarily be unhappy because there's something wrong with them per se, but that it highlights that as a society, we might be treating single people differently that actually puts them at risk for well-being costs.
So while the effect may hold true, the assumptions that we make about that, there is a structural piece at play. There's an impact on well-being, not due to the singledom itself.
Correct. And I mean, that's not to say that the individual characteristics and things like that don't matter, right? Like we also show that people, for example, who are more insecure or who have personality traits like being more neurotic or not being as extroverted or conscientiousness, that also makes a difference. So it's not that I'm completely saying we should absolve all single people of any personal accountability, but it's more than just one explanation. And I think opening up to contemplating that, yeah, there are sort of larger societal issues at play here that can explain that effect is important in a way that I think we do with many other underrepresented and marginalized groups, right? Like, it wouldn't be good to say, for example, there's research showing that people of color experience a lack of well-being or lower well-being compared to sort of white people. But no one's saying that that's because there's something inherently wrong with people of color. It's because we recognize that there are systemic differences and institutional things in place that make life difficult for people of color. So I think in the same way, and I'm not trying to equate singleism exactly with racism, but I think in a similar way, we want to kind of think broadly about the reasons for why we attribute single people at being at risk for lower well-being compared to coupled people. And denying that that doesn't exist doesn't do justice for single people that might really be struggling.
Right. What else do people get wrong about singledom?
Well, I think another assumption is that all single people are unhappy. And I think there's good literature coming out now and good evidence coming out that there's a wide range of, happiness levels among singles. And that while some single people are finding singlehood challenging and they're struggling with that, that's a completely common and valid experience. That there's also a sizable number of singles who are really happy and thriving.
Okay, so I want to speak to both of those groups. Let's start with the person who is single. They're either single by choice or by circumstance, but either way, they feel good about their position. They feel good being single, but they're experiencing isolation maybe from friends and family, and all they want to talk about is their relationships. All they want to do is coupled activities. What do you say to them?
I think one of the important things about this conversation is that it shouldn't just be about what do we say to those single people, but it should be what are we saying broadly to people everywhere, even those people, and maybe particularly for people who are coupled. Because what you're describing is actually not that much in control of a single person. Like, if you're happy with your single status and you keep getting questioned from friends and family about like, well, who are you dating? I've actually stopped asking my single friends and family this question, because if the minute you ask that question, what it's doing is it's setting up the assumption that that is what you should be doing and that's something that's important or like a goal that needs to be obtained, right? So it's like, if you want to bring up your dating life with me, then sure, you bring it up and we'll talk about it. But I've stopped asking that question. And I think that it's an opportunity for people who are coupled and have single friends or single family members to reflect on like the kinds of questions that they ask them and what that might be implying about what they should be trying to obtain and what's important. And one thing that we don't know enough about is how these thriving singles, how do they actually cope with all of this discrimination and social pressure? Or we don't know enough about that yet. So I think that's like one thing that would be very interesting to see in this research, and how are these thriving singles navigating that? And then also just, finding sort of comfort in the fact that like, if you're thriving as a single person, that's really setting you up for success and having a good life, regardless of where you end up. So for example, we show in our research, this is some research that my colleagues and I recently published, where we actually isolated a cluster of single people that were really secure in themselves and their attachment to close others. And these singles tended to be really happy across the board. And they were still open to romantic relationships, mind you. So it's not that they were sort of, I'm single and I'm happy and I really don't want to be in a relationship. It wasn't really that. It's just they were like happy and secure in themselves. That meant that they had good relationships with family and friends. They were out there like doing their thing. They were thriving. And if the right person comes along, if that's something that they're interested in, then great. And if not, well, that's cool too. So I think for those single people, keep doing what you're doing, because like it's working clearly. And I think that it sets you up for success regardless of, where your life kind of takes you, because at the end of the day, we need to be secure in ourselves and we need to have sort of self-confidence and self-concept clarity about who we are, what we want in life, all of those things.
It's such a good point to say it's actually not your job it's actually not your responsibility or your problem. You know, that is a them issue.
Yeah.
You are thriving, keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
And then to also hear that on the other side for coupled people and for families and friends of single people to think about the impact that they're having.
The great thing about doing this kind of work and seeing people sort of talk about this, like in these sort of spaces with podcasts that are designed for lay people out there, is that everyone starts off single, right? Like we're all born at least romantically single. And the more we kind of project this like idea of there's nothing wrong with being single, you should actually like feel really secure with yourself before necessarily like trying to get into a relationship just for the sake of getting into a relationship. I think this is really a good thing. It's a good thing for the person themselves. And if that person, you know, does get into a romantic relationship at some point, hopefully it kind of serves as a reminder that when they're interacting with their single friends and family, that, you know, I don't need to be pestering them about being in a relationship, that if they're happy, then they're happy. And there's nothing like that I need to do about that.
I love what you said about how if you are single and you find happiness and contentment and that sense of self when single, that it's almost like a safety net of knowing that however you end up, however life ends up, you're going to be okay. Like, what a superpower.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really do think it is. And I think ultimately, you know, people that think that a romantic relationship is sort of going to magically fix their problems in life. I mean, I think to some extent that may be true for some things, right? Like, I think there are some structural things that a romantic relationship or a partner can like offer. Things like being able to split financial costs, for example, right? So I'm not trying to undermine that, but I think that that kind of ideology is not necessary. It doesn't set people up necessarily for success in those relationships. We've shown this with our research. We examined people's like relationship pedestal beliefs, which is this idea that like you have to be in a romantic relationship to be truly happy. And we found that if you actually endorse that belief, it actually makes you more fearful of being single. And that undermines your life satisfaction. But we showed the exact same thing with people who are in relationships. And not only was it bad for their life satisfaction, it was actually bad for their relationship too.
Wow, yeah.
I guess because they were so nervous about like, oh, I want to hold on to this relationship. I'm so fearful of breaking up and being single. That also bled into their romantic relationship and they were less satisfied in those relationships.
How do folks who are not thriving and single, who are not happy being single, maybe they're searching for that next relationship or they are going through a heartbreak, how do they move toward that thriving space?
That's such a tough question. And I wish that there was like take this pill.
Yes.
You'd be happy. And I wish that the answer was like as simple as that. With so many things in life, it's obviously more complicated. I think part of this is trying to maybe take space to try and understand like the source of that unhappiness, right?
Ooh.
Is it because you have these ingrained notions that, oh, I need a romantic partner to be truly happy, right? Like if you've got that in your mind, then like start challenging those assumptions, trying to like figure out, well, why do I believe that? And like, you know, I grew up with like Disney movies that basically just like pummeled this message into the minds of so many young people. But I think, again, like the research is showing that that's not necessarily a great belief to be endorsing. And so like if that is the root cause of your unhappiness, then like maybe that's where you need to put in the work to try and like challenge those assumptions. If the root cause of your unhappiness is that you're feeling immense pressure from other people or you're not feeling supported from your family and friends, then maybe that's like, then focus on that. Like that's a conversation that you need to have with people, right? And I think figuring out ways to like have those conversations is important because relationship status is such a flexible life stage. We can't just break up with anyone in our life that enters into a romantic relationship, right? Like that's not a viable solution. So if that is what's causing you unhappiness as a single person, is that constant questioning and constant pressure from people, maybe it's a time to sit down with those people and say like, hey, I know you are well-meaning and just want to see me like happy and settled. But, when you ask me that, this is how it makes me feel. And don't shoot the messenger, but maybe sometimes it is because of your own insecurities, right? And just sort of being like, if I've had a series of dating relationships that just like they keep not working out, maybe just like having a moment of self-reflection in a way that's not defensive, in a way that's like non-judgmental, to just be like, are there bad patterns that I am getting into? That sort of, and I think that's like an important thing. And again, not in a judgmental way. We all have baggage and we could all do with some like good therapy from time to time.
Non-judgmental, non-defensive self-reflection. We could all use some of that.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right?
No.
Like if you kind of sit down and like are really honest with yourself and are like, there's a pattern. What's the pattern? I'm always like looking for a guy in finance, 6'5", blue. Like if that's my pattern, then like maybe there's something there.
You've come to the right place. Welcome to the internet.
But you know what I mean?
I do, yeah.
If it's the same pattern of behavior, if it's the same kind of relationship pattern that you find yourself getting into, maybe I need to sort of question my own behavior and the types of relationships I'm getting to, the types of partners I'm attracted to, and kind of trying to distangle that. I think that's also like a viable thing to consider. So I think like the advice would be like, why are you really unhappy with being single, and trying to identify that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it could be that you have a super supportive family. It could be that you're really thriving in a way that like, you're putting in time with your friends, you're traveling, you're, really investing in yourself and the relationship with yourself. You have dated some really great people, but those relationships just like didn't feel quite right and things haven't worked out the way you anticipated. Everything could be right, and sometimes it really just can come down to the two pieces of the puzzle sometimes need to fit right. And that can be really tough because that can be really like something that's out of our control. That's a corner of the unhappy singlehood space that I think is really difficult, because I don't think there's necessarily something that you can do or other people can do that can really change that. And it's just trying to, I don't know the answer to that. It's coming to terms with like accepting that sometimes the stars need to align a little bit, but until they don't, keep doing what you're doing and
care for yourself
and focus on the great other close relationships that you have in your life. Maybe one day things will sort of work out the way you're hoping that they will, even if they don't. Because you've kind of built that foundation for yourself, you can still have like a really great life.
Absolutely.
That's a place of tension and a place that like single people need to navigate. And that's like a whole other space. Like we've talked about the thriving singles. We've talked a little bit about the unhappy. And then there is this sort of space where single people, where like, life hasn't panned out the way I wanted it to, and kind of dealing with that and sort of, grieving that. And I think that's like a loss. That's for some single people, everything has been like absolutely great in their life. It just hasn't worked out. And now they have to grieve certain things. Looking at your life and being like, well, I wasn't able to get married, or at least not yet, that hasn't happened. Or depending on sort of people's ages and situation, whether they wanted to have children and how that is something they may now have to grieve. Finding yourself being in your 40s or 50s and being like, well, I wasn't able to have a family. So I think that there is definitely this space in between that's really challenging. And I think that's a really valid space to be in. And I'm not sure there's anything that I can say that's going to make that more comfortable for people.
I wonder, is there currently research on sexual satisfaction and singledom? Because I'm wondering if there can be any comfort offered in research that has shown positive outcomes for folks who are choosing to be single or single for whatever reason.
Definitely, one of the biggest benefits that are often talked about by single people is that singlehood offers them a lot of flexibility, autonomy, and freedom. And so I think that that is one really great thing. And I don't think that's to say that being in a relationship completely like destroys the possibility of all of those things. But of course, when you're in a romantic relationship, you do have to sort of consider another person's, goals and motivations and desires. So I think as a single person, basically the world's your oyster, right? Like if you wanted to take that awesome job opportunity that requires you to move to a different city or to a different country, or if you want to travel a lot, like you can just do what you want.
You can
literally.
do it.
You can do it. And so I think that is one of the major benefits that sort of is talked about in the literature. And then in terms of sexual satisfaction, I think this is another important piece, because a lot of our other psychological needs can be met by friends and family. When we think about sort of companionship and belongingness and feeling loved and cared about and, things like that, there's research showing that, our friendships, especially for single people, is like a really important source of meeting those needs, as our family members. And when single people are satisfied with their friendship and their family networks, they tend to be a lot happier with being, or happier with life. One of the domains that's difficult for friends and family to fulfill is sexual needs. We often kind of house this as sort of something that romantic partners can provide. And so there is research. This is research that has been conducted by some of my colleagues, Eubin Park, Jeff McDonald. They have sort of shown that when single individuals are able to satisfy sexual needs outside of a romantic relationship, that actually they tend to be really happy with life. They also tend to be really happy with being single. They desire a romantic relationship less in those situations because they're meeting those sexual needs that they wouldn't in a romantic relationship. So it's like, well, why do I then need to be in a relationship if I can get that? Now, that's not to say that all romantic relationships just boil down just to sex, but especially I think living in societies such as North America, where having sex outside of marriage is like, it's way more accepted here than it is in other cultures. That it's an opportunity for singles to explore that. But also it depends on like what your sexual desire is, right? Like I think for single people that have a high sex drive, like meeting your sexual needs with non-romantic others is a great way for you to meet those needs without necessarily needing to be in a romantic relationship. And if you don't have much of a sexual desire, then being single kind of works out really great for you too, because there's like there's no like pressure that you need to be having sex with your partner or anything like that.
Obviously, everyone's going to have different needs, but to think about the general needs of connection, support, intimacy or sex, and how we kind of assume, or we're taught to assume, that we're going to find this one person that's going to be our romantic partner, and they're going to fulfill all those needs, and they're going to be in all of those roles and take care of all of those pieces for us. And it's interesting, this conversation is happening in the context of talking about people who are single, when I think it could probably do anybody some good to think about what those needs are and where you're having them met, and whether or not it's appropriate, sufficient to expect your romantic partner to fulfill all those things.
Yeah, I think you're right. And actually, there was some recently interesting work done by a relationships researcher called Eli Finkel, where he talked a lot about this idea of like the all or nothing marriage. And there's a whole set of resources you could and rabbit hole you could go down with that. But essentially, the idea was that one of the reasons we might be seeing increases in divorce rates now compared to before is because we expect our romantic partners now to fulfill way more needs than we ever did. So sort of historically speaking, romantic partners were sort of just like, they fulfilled the basics, psychological needs, food, water, shelter kind of thing. And then there was sort of belongingness that became about friendship. Then in the 1960s, we had the love revolution. And then it became this really like romanticized version of marriage that you didn't marry for like political reasons or for safety or security, but you married because you fell in love with someone. And that now we want our partners to do all of those things. Plus, I want you to support me in my goals.
Right.
Right? So we're like, I want you to do this. And that's like a lot to put on one person. And like if a person is able to do all of that, A, they're superhuman. But B, it means that you're going to be really happy in that marriage. But we live in an era where like we're really tired, we don't have enough time, and we don't have enough resources to do all of these things. And so it basically ends up creating cracks in a lot of marriages. And I think it applies broadly to committed relationships generally. But expecting so much from a partner can put so much like undue pressure on that person. And it can lead to people feeling like their expectations unmet in relationships. And that can sort of lead to, relationships sort of breaking apart and falling down. All of that to sort of say what that perspective suggests is that, we should try and move away from this idea that a romantic relationship partner can do all of these things and should be, expected to do all of these things. And instead try and sort of broaden our spectrum of people that we turn to for different psychological needs. And so I think this kind of message dovetails really nicely with the work on singlehood, because one thing that single people might be able to do well is that they don't kind of put all their eggs in one basket, but they're actually diversifying where they get all their psychological needs met. The tension, I think, becomes is when you do have all of your eggs in different baskets, they may also feel like, oh, but where's the one person that will always be there kind of for me?
The stability.
The stability piece of it. And I think what romantic partners, regardless of whether they actually do all of those things or not, they offer a sense, I think, of security and stability for people psychologically that just makes people feel like better. Like if something really bad happened, or at the end of the day, no matter what, I know there's this one person that will always be there for me. And single people may have that, but I think it is a tension that often comes up when you're, you may have people kind of in different aspects of your life, but does that still make you feel like you have that one person that is sort of expected to drop everything and be there for you if needed?
If somebody is listening to this, right, and they're going, oh, okay, well, I'm in a relationship and I have been expecting all of these things from my partner, or what you're describing about a self-concept and a freedom and autonomy and those kinds of things, how could somebody build more of that into the relationship that they're already in?
There's a lot of research showing that actually people in relationships, they tend to report like really high levels of autonomy and feelings of independence, at least the ones that are in like good, supportive romantic relationships. Because I think one thing that our partners allow us to do is to focus on a lot of the goals that we're trying to obtain. So for example, like if I want to go to an academic conference, like my partner will help support that goal by staying home with the kids, right? And so like I have someone in my corner basically like helping me feel more autonomous and independent and, go like build your career by supporting me with other things in our life. The other part of it is also feeling really secure in your relationship, that if you do want to go out with your friends and, build those other non-romantic close relationships that are also really important, that you don't feel like that is threatening to your relationship, your romantic relationship. And I think that's often really important because, and there's research showing this, anyone who has like a close friend who got into a relationship will tell you that when people get into relationships, they sort of tend to really focus inward into that romantic relationship, and the friendship relationships kind of take a hit. That's important to some extent at the beginning because I think a lot of people are investing in that relationship. But I think once you kind of get out of that honeymoon phase, it's important to kind of reflect on that and, try and return to those other relationships that you have with your family, with your friends, with your colleagues or people in your community, and make sure that there's a good balance there between time spent with your romantic partner and time spent with these other important relationships you have.
Can you talk a bit about attachment styles and how that might impact somebody's experience of being single or in relationship?
It's one of the most robust theories in social psychology, relationship science. I've done my own training in attachment theory, looking at romantic relationships. So for those people who might not be as familiar, attachment theory is really about people's expectations about how they think other people are available or reliable or will be there for them. Now, it's really broadly applicable to all types of close relationships, but I think often in dating and relationship context, we think about it in terms of a romantic partner. People who are high in attachment anxiety, they tend to question whether others truly love them, or if they're as invested in the relationship like they are. And this is kind of like our trope of like a really clingy person in a relationship who needs excessive reassurance that they're loved and cared about and that their partner is committed to them. You also have highly avoidant people. These are individuals who tend to have difficulty trusting that people are dependent and reliable, that they're available, and instead they try and sort of push people away and instead rely on themselves. So this is our kind of cultural trope of someone who's really non-committal in relationships and really sort of cold and aloof.
Mm-hmm.
People who are low on those two dimensions are what we would call someone who's securely attached. They tend to have positive, trusting beliefs that people can be relied on, will be there for them, and they don't have any difficulty kind of letting people in and experiencing closeness and intimacy with others. So attachment theory has obviously been really influential in romantic relationships. We know that people who are more insecure, so people who are more anxious and avoidant, they tend to, have some not so great outcomes in romantic relationships. Recently, my colleagues and I looked at attachment within just a single population.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually found very similar clusters of, anxious, avoidant, secure singles. And what we tended to find is our really highly anxious single people tended to have some of the worst outcomes. They were really fearful of being single. They really wanted to be in a relationship, but they really struggled. So they had they tended to have lower life satisfaction. They were less satisfied with their interpersonal relationships with family and friends. Avoidant singles, they tended to be, they tended to have the lowest desire for a romantic partner, which is not surprising.
Yep.
They tended to do better than highly anxious people. So they weren't as fearful about being single. They reported pretty good relationships with friends and family and relatively good well-being. There's other research showing that avoidant people are actually really happy being single because they don't have to deal with all the emotional ickiness that they don't like, right? What our research also showed is that secure cluster tended to be the happiest single cluster. So they were happy with themselves. They didn't fear being single. They had the best relationships with their family and friends, and they tended to report the highest well-being. Interestingly, they had moderate levels of desire for a relationship. So again, it's not that they were sort of rebuffing or rejecting romantic relationships. They were just whatever happens, happens. I'm open to the possibility. And so really, this is one of the things I think as an attachment theorist as well, I'm just it's important to build that security in yourself because I think ultimately we know that this is one of the most robust individual difference characteristics that help people live fulfilling lives, regardless of whether they're single or in a relationship.
It's really interesting to hear that attachment style comes into play even outside of relationship because, you hear about it mostly in terms of romantic partnerships and the dynamics, how they play out there.
I think it's had a lot of influence with sort of the general public in that domain, and I can totally understand why that is. It's sort of a sexy theory to think about in the context of our romantic relationships. But I think attachment theory, at its core, actually started thinking about John Bowlby's work on attachment, Mary Ainsworth's work on attachment. That really started by examining the parent-child relationship.
Yes.
And it's just integral to our evolution in terms of our survival. And I think often when we think about anxious and avoidant, characteristics, we think, oh, these are such bad, maladaptive things later in life. And to some extent, yes, it has negative repercussions. But theoretically anyway, it's meant to arise in young children as a way to cope and survive when you've got a caregiver who isn't necessarily available or meeting your needs. We talk about it as if it's boxes, but it's sort of more that you're on a continuum. So you're low versus high on attachment anxiety, low versus high in attachment avoidance. and that, it has ripple effects for how we regulate our own emotions. And that's regardless of whether we're single or whether we're in a relationship.
Can somebody work on their attachment style or look to move more towards security while not in a romantic relationship?
There's a lot of work showing, for example, that people in relationships, if they have a partner that sort of helps manage their insecurities, that they can actually become more secure over time. But I think the same thing can be true for single people. Now, some of that could be that, that security comes from how they're supported by friends and family. So if you have really supportive friends and family as a single person, that might help you kind of become more secure over time. But I also think this is that self-reflective, non-judgmental, self-reflective piece I was referring to earlier, that, if you're finding yourself, there are patterns in the way that even you respond in relationships or when you're dating, this is an important kind of way to think about, like, okay, do I have some like insecurity that I need to work through? And I think even just being aware of this is, I think, really helpful because, no one's perfect. And I think that even in a romantic relationship context or in a singlehood or a dating context, there may be things that trigger reactions, right, in people. And being aware of that, I think, can go a long way. If you have money to spend on therapy, then I think that's like a really great, also because that's a really safe space to explore these ideas and to practice skill building around, like, if you've gone on a date with someone and you text them what a great time you had and they don't reply back, but you see that they've seen the message, like how are you going to respond, and like what are you going to do? And if you feel like, oh, there's definitely a pattern of like, oh, I do this in those instances, or, whatever. I think in a therapeutic context, that's a great place to sort of explore some of that and kind of think about, oh, why do I respond in that way? Or why do I feel a certain way when that happens? Or why is my automatic conclusion always something sort of like bad instead of a more benevolent attribution? So I think that, like, to do that in a therapeutic space is great, but I also completely understand that that comes from a place of privilege to be able to have access to money, to have access to therapeutic healthcare. But I think, again, like, there's so many resources out there. Like, we live in this really great digital age that I think just even reading about some of these theories and reflecting on your own behavior might be helpful for people. The thing, of course, is you want to make sure that you're going to the right sources, because everyone with a mic can kind of say whatever they want. So you just want to make sure, yeah, it is true. So maybe just making sure, that's just my kind of like, yeah, just, bear in mind who is actually talking about this and what are their qualifications, as opposed to just listening to anybody with a mic on TikTok. So
They could start by following your lab's Instagram.
They could, absolutely. Shameless plug.
Yes. Which will be linked in the description. It'll be linked in the show notes. If you want to know more about any of this, I'll have resources down there. In your work with singlehood and the research that you've done, what is one thing that you've learned that you wish everybody knew?
One of the things that I really wish that people kind of take away from doing this kind of work or like having these experiences is that there should not be like a war between single people versus coupled people. And sort of breaking away from this need to win this battle of who is happiest is, I think, something that I wish people would kind of like, step away from, and instead kind of be open to the fact that, like, we're all on this path of trying to strive for happiness. Some of us, are able to do that regardless of what relationship status we're in. Some of us feel like we can only do and only meet our life's goals if we have a romantic partner. Some of us struggle with this even if we're in a romantic relationship. And so I think just having like a more inclusive discussion about this in a way that's like, I'm not trying to win any battles here about like who's happiest. Is it single people? Is it people in relationships? And also like within spaces, right? Like, so even within singlehood communities, not trying to be like, well, I've chosen to be single and so I'm really happy, but you're sad because you really want a relationship partner, but you're like, that's your thing. And, like even trying to make sure that there's no division within those communities is, I think, important. Because, for example, like you asked me earlier, like, what advice can we give for people who are really struggling with singlehood? What can they do to like lead this amazing single life? And it's like, I think some of the people that we can learn that the best answer to that are from people who are thriving and single, right? And so if we create a more inclusive conversation about this, and make it less about like who's coming out on top, who's winning this battle on unhappiness, then maybe we can all just learn from one another, regardless of like what relationship status we have, how we got there, whether it was chosen or not, what other identities like we have that like intersect with our singlehood. Because the experience of singlehood as, a white single man probably looks really different to a Black single mom, right? And so I think just being more accepting and being more inclusive about this is something that I kind of wish people will just sort of bear in mind when they're having these conversations or entering these kinds of spaces.
Perfectly put. Couldn't agree more. We are going to hop over to the Patreon exclusive extended version in a minute. But before we go, where can people find you if they want more?
You sort of already alluded to our lab's Instagram page. So it's at securelab.sfu. So you can follow us on Instagram. We often share sort of upcoming research that we're publishing from our lab. And actually, if you follow us, you'll be able to follow other scholars who have their own Instagram pages on this topic. And I think this is like one way that you can kind of follow along. Our lab often publishes op-eds as well, where we try and disseminate the research that we're doing to the lay public through op-eds. So I think that's like a one-stop place that you can kind of go towards. I also have like an educational podcast called Merlot with My Beau. I started this with my husband during the pandemic when we had to move all of our university lectures from in-person to online. So there are episodes on there. So for example, we have 2 seasons, quote unquote, for 2 different courses that I teach at university. And so if people kind of want to do a deep dive on attachment insecurities or on singlehood or other aspects of being in a romantic relationship, that's kind of another way more extended kind of way that you can get into it. And one of the cool things about that educational podcast is that I sometimes also invite other scholars to come and talk. So that's kind of nice because the conversations that I have with my husband on that podcast is we kind of joke that he's sort of the everyday Joe perspective, and his name is Steve, so he's like the
everyday Steve.
He's just like and my students really love him because he really asks he's not an academic, so he asks the questions that I think like any other layperson would be thinking about, and then sometimes we have like nerdy academics kind of nerd out in between. So yeah.
I'm going to check that out. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for sharing all of your knowledge. This was a really great conversation. Thanks for listening. You can also access all of our extended cut episodes with bonus content from every single guest over on Patreon at patreon.com/AlaynaJoy. That's patreon.com/ALAYNAJoy. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at sleepingaroundpod for updates, teasers, episode discussions, and more. This episode was produced by Alayna Joy and Danae Fender and edited by Corey Mosquita. See you next time back here on the couch.